Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we have a mission, and it's a big one. We are going to cut right through about 1,700 years of, well, traditional institutional narrative.
That's right.
We're here to trace what our sources are calling the Great Detour, and our focus is purely forensic. We're not here for a theological debate.
Absolutely not.
We're here to serve you, the listener, with a clear map of the specific legal, political, and systemic mechanisms that caused the early church to so dramatically change its entire structure.
And that's the key, right there. We have to operate completely outside of any denominational lenses. Our only goal is to identify the political path, the actual road signs, the jurisdictional stop signs that took the original followers of Christ.
Who were demonstrably Torah observant.
Demonstrably. Keeping the Sabbath, the food laws, the holy days set up by the Father. And it steered them onto a path that resulted in the modern institutional church.
A church which is, for the most part, completely divorced from that original Hebraic foundation. So we're tracing a historical roadmap. We're looking for the actual governmental edicts, the legal canons that were deliberately put in place. The mission is to chart this specific journey from what the sources call the Nazarene Blueprint,
The apostolic way.
to what they call the Constantinian Counterfeit.
And in doing that, we have to answer the core historical question. Where and how did that original apostolic way, which was unified, it was governed by the Father's instructions, get legally canceled?
Canceled. That's a very modern term for it.
It is, but it's accurate here. And more importantly, why is that specific history, which is recorded in, clear punitive legal decrees, why is it so effectively obscured or just rebranded today?
Okay, to help us analyze this huge shift, the sources actually give us a framework. It's a four-stage strategy that was used by the institutional powers to shift divine law from an absolute imperative to, well, a debatable hypothesis. They call it the Genesis Protocol.
Yes, and this protocol is the analytic tool we're going to use throughout this deep dive. It's got 4 stages. First, interrogation, then exaggeration, third is contradiction, and finally, imputation.
Oh.
We're going to see how this exact pattern was applied step by step to systematically replace the original faith.
All right, before we get into that, let's establish the starting line. The original church was the one new man fellowship. What does that actually mean in practical historical terms?
Historically, it means the fellowship was made up of both Jew and Gentile, living literally side by side in obedience to the Father's universal instructions, the law.
Right.
Their unity was not based on some abstract belief system. It was based on shared practice. And the focus was absolutely fixed on the necessity of internal transformation.
The circumcision of the heart.
That's the phrase. This focus on orthopraxy, on right action, is what defined the Nazarenes. And this starting point is so crucial because its very nature made it totally incompatible with Roman imperial stability.
And that brings us right to the collision. The sources describe the early apostolic church and the Roman Empire as being on a trajectory that was like a freight train hitting a concrete wall.
It was inevitable.
What made them so fundamentally incompatible from Rome's perspective?
The incompatibility was purely political and jurisdictional. The Nazarene faith, which was built on this idea of a circumcised heart, it meant your ultimate loyalty was to a divine external lawgiver.
Not the emperor.
Not the emperor. Their unity was based on the word, which made them, completely resistant to state manipulation. Rome relied on controlling religion for social order, for military loyalty, even for tax collection.
So a population whose loyalty is to some unchangeable heavenly king.
And whose unifying practices, the Sabbath, the feasts, were completely outside the Roman civic calendar.
That's a liability, a huge one.
It's a massive political liability.
So when Emperor Constantine steps onto the scene in the early 4th century, his intervention, which our sources call Pillar 1, it's a jurisdictional solution to a political problem. It's not a spiritual one.
Precisely. The merger of the church and the state was a political necessity for imperial stability. Constantine's goal was to make this new, rapidly growing group Christianity a predictable, centralized tool for social control across a huge, fracturing Roman territory.
The source material really captures the gravity of it. It says, "The bride of Christ traded her divine groom for a Roman throne."
And that shift is everything. It transformed faith from a spiritual practice rooted in obedience into a standardized governmental bureaucracy.
And the first step in that bureaucratic process was applying that Genesis protocol.
Mm.
They had to ask that first question, "Yea, hath God said?" Or, in political terms, Is this law really absolute?
Yes, that's the interrogation phase. And the place where this interrogation was literally institutionalized was the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD.
Right, Nicaea. Most people just think of the Nicene Creed.
They do, but for this deep dive, the political purpose was, frankly, far more relevant than the theological outcome.
That's the key. While the Creed defined theological boundaries, the underlying political purpose of Nicaea was to fully unify the Roman Empire by creating a universal or Catholic religion that was explicitly and legally separate from its Hebraic roots.
And to do that, the state needed to exaggerate the difference between the old and the new. This is the exaggeration stage of the Genesis Protocol.
Where they weaponized the Jewish label.
Exactly. They had to make the original apostolic practice seem not just different, but frankly, dangerous and detestable to the Roman way of thinking.
And the most direct legal manifestation of this separation targeted a foundational holy day, Passover. How did they turn that into a legal weapon?
Well, Constantine issued a very explicit edict of separation right after the Council of Nicaea. He explicitly sought to distance the new state church from what he called, and this is a direct and frankly ugly quote from the historical edict, the detestable Jewish crowd. And we have to be clear, this was not some revelation of freedom. This was a legal move to sever Gentile followers of Christ from their Jewish brothers and sisters who were still following the biblical lunar calendar.
It's an independence from their own history. What legal precedent did he even invoke to just reset the calendar for an entire religion?
The premise was imperial authority over the church's jurisdiction. The edict essentially said that since the original practices were too closely linked to a group, the Jews that had opposed the Roman state, the new universal faith needed a new politically neutral calendar.
And the consequence of that was monumental.
It was. The consequence being the mandatory move to Easter and, by extension, cementing Sunday worship as the official day of assembly.
And the timing of Easter wasn't an accident.
Not at all. The sources are very clear that the calculation for Easter was a Roman formula specifically designed to never fall on the same day as the Jewish Passover.
It's a deliberate act of contradiction.
The third stage of the protocol, exactly, establishing a replacement holiday that functioned in the exact opposite way to the original father's appointment.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, this single jurisdictional move at Nicaea desynced the church from the Father's divine appointments. It legally established the very first wall of separation.
But not between man and sin.
No, between the institution and its own historical roots.
It created a separate time clock for the new institution, one dictated entirely by Rome. This act transformed the rhythm of worship from a cycle set by the heavens and the Father's instructions into a cycle set by the emperor's need for political unity.
Once the calendar was set by the emperor, the path was clear to dismantle everything else.
The Sabbath, the food laws, the feasts, the rest of the Nazarene Blueprint.
So that foundation, that new non-Hebraic calendar, was laid. Now the state church had to move on to the actual practices that defined the original followers.
Right.
This moves us into the implementation phase. The legal and physical actions taken to actually criminalize the original apostolic way. We're not just talking about theology anymore. We're talking about making obedience to the original instructions a prosecutable offense.
And this brings us right back to Pillar 2, the systematic weaponization of the Jewish label. The first step in criminalizing obedience was rebranding. Rome successfully took the Father's universal instructions, the Sabbath, food laws, feasts, and labeled them as Jewish customs.
And why was that rebranding so effective in a Roman context?
Because it turned what was a neutral religious practice into a political threat. I mean, in the 4th century, Rome already viewed Jewish populations with a lot of suspicion, even outright hostility after numerous uprisings.
Sure.
So by labeling obedience to the law as Judaizing, they instantly created this artificial wall. Obedience became legally and socially toxic. It was a sign of subversive loyalty to a rival, a defeated jurisdiction rather than spiritual devotion.
It made it sinful for a Gentile to follow the original commands.
And politically dangerous for a Jew to continue practicing his own heritage within this new church structure.
The ultimate and really devastating manifestation of this whole strategy was the Council of Laodicea, around 364 AD. The sources describe this as the official cancel decree for the Sabbath.
This council produced what is, I think, arguably the most essential legal smoking gun for understanding this whole detour, Canon 29.
Okay.
This is the document that unequivocally criminalized the seventh-day Sabbath and replaced it with Sunday worship. This was the moment that the contradiction phase became permanent law.
We need to hear the precise wording of Canon 29, because this is the legal mechanism that replaced the divine commandment.
Okay, the canon states, Christians must not Judaize by resting on the Sabbath Saturday, but must work on that day, rather honoring the Lord's Day Sunday, and if they can, resting then as Christians.
It's a forceful governmental decree. It demands action on Saturday and veneration of Sunday.
But the real power, the enforcement mechanism, that lies in the penalty clause.
The hammer blow.
Absolutely, it says, but if any shall be found to be Judaizers, let them be anathema cursed excommunicated from Christ. The state church didn't just recommend a calendar change.
No, they issued an institutional death sentence.
That is immense. Resting on the day commanded by the Father, the fourth commandment, became a legal crime, punishable by the highest spiritual penalty the institution had.
It's the ultimate act of institutional control.
It is. And the significance is that it made observing the fourth commandment a spiritual and legal offense against the state church. And this confirms two vital facts for us.
Okay.
First, the original apostolic practice of resting on Saturday was still so prevalent 3 centuries later that it required a specific, forceful, and punitive legal ban.
Right. If nobody was doing it, you wouldn't need a law against it.
Exactly. And second, the forceful replacement of the seventh-day Sabbath with the sun god's day, Sunday, was cemented by civil and ecclesiastical law, not by some New Testament spiritual shift. This was a decree of man overriding a command of the Father.
And this decree didn't just affect the calendar. It completely reframed the law itself. It moved it from being a standard of righteousness to an institutional shackle.
It moved the law into that final stage of the Genesis protocol, imputation. They reframed the lawgiver as a kind of hoarder of wisdom whose laws were restrictive and oppressive rather than protective and unifying.
So if the law is bad, then avoiding it by worshiping on Sunday and working on Saturday is good.
And that's how the system began to establish its own laws as superior to the divine law.
So the Sabbath was attacked by legal decree, but the sources reveal an even more, visceral and brutal tactic used against the food laws, this so-called pork loyalty test around 333 AD.
Yeah, this is a shocking anecdote. It gives us a really stark look at the raw, physical application of state propaganda and assimilation. The political need was clear. They had all these mass converts, often obtained under duress, and the state needed to vet their true loyalties. The pretext, as it's recorded, was that many converts had joined the institutional church just out of fear of death, but were still tied to their religion, meaning the law in their hearts.
And the method that Emperor Constantine and Patriarch Paul of Constantinople used was designed to force a clear, visible break from that law.
It was a religious purity test, and it was designed to leave zero ambiguity. The order was issued that cooked pork of food expressly forbidden by the Father's law be distributed to people leaving church on Easter Sunday.
Wow. Think about that scene. The day that symbolized the resurrection was turned into a brutal test of submission to imperial authority.
And the outcome for anyone who hesitated?
They were killed on the spot.
Anyone who refused to eat the pork was automatically deemed a Judaizer, someone whose heart was still loyal to the law rather than the emperor's new religion, and they were killed right there.
This wasn't subtle pressure.
No, this was immediate, fatal consequence. It was a forced ritual used to violently identify and eliminate those who were still loyal to the Father's instructions.
An action like that needs institutional justification. How did Patriarch Paul provide the theological bypass for mandating the consumption of an abomination?
He provided the institutional narrative that, frankly, persists to this day. He justified the mandate by asserting, and I'm quoting, Christ repealed all provisions of the Torah and gave us a new law. Therefore, it is not wrong to eat pork.
Here's the cover.
The complete theological covering for forced assimilation. It wasn't about freedom of conscience. It was about mandated compliance under penalty of death, justified by a brand new institutional doctrine.
The impact on that original one new man fellowship must have been immediate and just. Devastating.
Oh, it created a permanent physical wall of separation. The original Jewish followers of Christ could no longer fellowship with Christians who were intentionally eating abominations as a sign of their new Roman freedom.
The shared table, the symbol of unity, was corrupted.
It was corrupted by mandated ritual impurity. The unity was shattered, not by a theological disagreement, but by a state-enforced dietary practice.
And to legally reinforce this new standard, the Council of Gangra, around 340 AD, followed up on Nicaea and this pork test by targeting dietary restrictions in general.
Yes, Gangra was all about securing the institutional lifestyle. They introduced Canon 2, which set a legal trap.
What did it say?
If anyone shall condemn him who eats flesh, as if he had no hope because of his eating it, let him be anathema.
That sounds on the surface like they were promoting religious tolerance, but its legal function was punitive.
Exactly. It was not a defense of freedom. It was a legal silencing mechanism. This decree was used to excommunicate, to declare anathema anyone who taught that the Father's food laws were still binding.
So by making the act of following the law a reason for excommunication.
They solidified the Roman Diet as the new necessary standard for institutional acceptance. The message was crystal clear. Your obedience is heresy.
This constant fighting against the original blueprint, it just confirms that these Nazarene practices were resilient. It forces you to ask, if the apostles had already clearly canceled these laws, why did Roman councils have to keep issuing death threats and anathemas 300 years later?
It confirms the laws were canceled by the emperor, not the apostles. And this reliance on state power forces the institution to resort to theological and critically semantic maneuvers to justify their position. This is where what the sources call the semantic theft of Scripture becomes really evident.
Let's talk about that theft, especially regarding Mark 7.12.
Right. Since the Constantinian institution needed some kind of biblical justification for its new diet, they retranslated, or, more accurately, they augmented the texts. In the sources, that phrase you find in modern Bibles, the parenthesis, thus he declared all foods clean, is identified as a later Greek gloss.
Okay, what exactly is a gloss in this context, and why does its inclusion fundamentally change the legal interpretation of the text?
A gloss is a commentary or an explanatory note that's added to the margin of a text. And over time, it sometimes got incorporated into the main body by later scribes who just mistook it for the original wording.
I see.
The original context of Mark 7 is all about ceremonial washing and the hypocrisy of tradition, not a list of dietary restrictions. By inserting that little phrase, the later institutional church retroactively manufactured a theological justification for the Roman diet,
Making it appear that Christ himself, not Constantine's decrees, canceled the universal food laws.
It's a retroactive theological bypass, inserted centuries later to support the 4th century political outcome of the pork test and the Gangra canons. And the same tactic was applied to Peter's vision in Acts 10.
The sheet of animals.
Yes. Theologians began rebranding that vision as being about permission to eat pork and shrimp. But Peter himself, the very person who had the vision, explicitly stated its true meaning.
He said the vision was about men, not food.
Exactly. Peter says very clearly in Acts 10.28, God hath showed me that I should not call any man common or unclean. The purpose was the inclusion of Gentiles men who were previously deemed ritually unclean into fellowship.
It was about people, not pork.
It was about Gentile inclusion, not dietary freedom. But the Constantinian narrative needed to justify eating forbidden foods, so they systematically rebranded the vision to support their 4th century lifestyle. That is semantic theft in its purest form.
The need to dismantle this Nazarene blueprint by force is cemented even further when we go back to the Council of Laodicea, specifically Canons 37 and 38. These canons prove that the original Nazarene one new man unity, centered around the feasts, was still very much alive.
Oh, absolutely. The state church knew that shared food and shared time creates unbreakable bonds. They had to attack fellowship directly. Canon 37 made it unlawful to receive portions sent from the feasts of Jews or heretics, nor to feast together with them.
So sharing food during Passover or other feasts, a fundamental act of communal unity between Jew and Gentile followers, was now criminalized by the institution.
And Canon 38 sealed the deal on the calendar front. It prohibited receiving unleavened bread from the Jews. This was a direct legal ban on observing Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread.
So you combine that with the forced switch to Easter at Nicaea.
And the separation from the Father's appointed times was complete, enforced by that chilling penalty of anathema.
This whole systemic process, the calendar shift, the Sabbath decree, the dietary mandates, it all funnels back to Pillar 4 of this Constantinian thesis. The ultimate goal of the Great Detour was the bypass of the heart.
Right. The institutional aim was political stability. And that is best achieved by creating a version of faith that requires minimal internal life-altering change.
A low barrier to entry.
Exactly. By criminalizing the law and the Hebraic calendar, and by introducing pagan-merged festivals like Christmas and Easter, the state created a low-bar entry for the masses of the Roman Empire.
This allowed people to claim the name of Christ and join the state religion without ever undergoing the required, difficult process of the circumcision of the heart that the apostolic doctrine demanded.
And this transition marks a really profound shift from the Hebrew mindset to the Greek mindset. It's a crucial concept for you to grasp.
Okay.
The apostolic way was rooted in the Hebrew perspective. It emphasized orthopraxy, action, obedience, and the internal reality of a circumcised heart, where your belief is demonstrated by what you do.
But the Constantinian counterfeit was rooted in the Greek perspective, emphasizing orthodoxy.
Abstract belief and complex doctrine became the focus. The Nicene Creed became the touchstone. As long as you believe the right things, the doctrines defined by the council, your daily lifestyle, your obedience to the Father's specific commands, your calendar, it didn't fundamentally matter to the institution.
This is the precise root of that modern theological position. The law doesn't matter as long as you believe in Jesus.
That statement is essentially speaking the language of 4th century Roman political philosophy, not the language of the unified, Torah-observant apostolic community.
The detour wasn't about simplifying faith. It was about shifting the requirement from internal transformation, which is hard and ungovernable, to external institutional conformity, which is easy to mandate and tax.
That's it, exactly.
Okay, so we have meticulously traced the political, legal, and frankly violent path of this detour. The question that remains is sociological. Why does this 1700-year history, these explicit legal decrees from Nicaea and Laodicea, remain so profoundly unexamined in the modern pulpit and pew? Why is this specific sequence of legal criminalization hidden?
The sources insist the answer is systemic preservation, or what they call institutional hiding. The institution that evolved from the Constantinian merger is the same system that controls the historical curriculum taught in seminaries and dictates the sermons preached from the pulpits today.
They're protecting a foundation that can't survive the truth of its own political origins.
That's the heart of it.
So let's break down the pillars of this institutional hiding architecture, starting with the succession myth, the formal doctrine of replacement theology.
This narrative is absolutely essential for the system's survival. Theology schools teach supersessionism, the claim that the Gentile church replaced Israel as God's exclusive vehicle. And this provides the ultimate historical blind spot.
How so?
Well, if the church is the new perfected authority, then Constantine's decrees aren't viewed as apostasy or a violent political power grab.
They're seen as evolution or God's providence.
Exactly. Necessary to expand the faith universally. And this narrative conveniently dismisses the Nazarenes.
They're not the blueprint anymore.
No, they're seen as a dead end that failed to evolve or adhere to the new universal mandate. This dismisses any need to examine the legal documents we just discussed. In the eyes of supersessionism, if the law was canceled by the emperor or if it was canceled by the apostles, the result is the same. The law is irrelevant today, so there's no need to ask who did the canceling.
And this foundational blind spot is reinforced by what the sources are calling the filter of the Reformation.
Right. Most Protestant and evangelical history classes are taught to only focus on history after 1517 AD, starting with Martin Luther. The Reformation was monumentally important for fixing the issue of salvation by works, but the sources characterize it as a halfway fix.
Because Luther and Calvin, while breaking free from Roman papal authority and fixing justification doctrine, still retained the Roman calendar and the Sunday tradition.
The very things that had been cemented by Constantine's decrees at Nicaea and Laodicea, they fixed the theological system of justification, how a person is declared righteous, but they retained the institutional architecture.
The calendar, the holidays, the day of rest.
The things Constantine had mandated for political stability. So modern theologians often stop their historical inquiry at the Reformation, believing it fixed everything. They don't realize that Luther only remodeled the house that Constantine built,
without digging up the Roman legal foundation to find the apostolic rock underneath.
They just accepted the 4th century calendar as an unexamined fact.
Now we get to what the sources bluntly call the meat of the matter. The institutional payroll and the high cost of truth. This moves us from historical records to present-day professional risk.
And this is the practical reality of systemic preservation. The sources are absolutely sobering on this point. If a pastor or a theologian working within an accredited denomination admits that Constantine canceled the original apostolic way, the professional consequences are immediate and severe.
They'd have to acknowledge that their institutional holidays, Christmas and Easter, are pagan merged, based not on scripture, but on the requirements of that Constantinian merger.
And most critically, they'd have to tell their congregation that they have been violating the Father's fourth commandment by meeting on the Lord's Day, the day enforced by Canon 29 for the last 1,700 years.
That challenges the very authority of the institution itself.
It's a professional death sentence. You'd lose your credentials, your license, your building, your salary. The institutional structure is designed to enforce conformity to that 4th century architecture.
And this brings us full circle to the legal penalty of the 4th century. The cancel fear today mirrors the anathemas from Canon 29.
Absolutely. Just as the council declared those observing the Sabbath anathema for Judaizing, a modern pastor who tries to teach the Nazarene way today, emphasizing obedience to the law and the Father's appointments, will be institutionally canceled by his denomination for being legalistic.
Or Judaizer.
The weaponized label from the 4th century is still the primary tool used today to enforce institutional conformity.
It's a cycle of generational blindness, built on the foundation of institutional survival. Because the truth comes with a paycheck deduction.
It does. And most people just trust the tradition handed down. If your parents and grandparents all ate pork and went to church on Sunday, the tradition just seems biblical by association. It bypasses the need to check the word or the history.
So the tradition itself bypasses the need for the circumcision of the heart.
Because it relies on external institutional obedience, doing what everyone else is doing, rather than the painful transformative commitment required to do what the word says.
And this necessity to defend the tradition leads to that systematic, semantic redefinition we see all the time in institutional apologetics.
Right. The institution had to rebrand the apostolic way to make it sound like a mistake. Instead of referring to the Nazarenes as the original followers of Yeshua, they're called Judaizers, which gets redefined as troublemakers who tried to rob Christians of their freedom.
And the Father's eternal instructions, the Sabbath, the food laws, the feasts, are rebranded, not as instructions, but as Old Covenant.
That term is used so strategically, it carries the implication that these instructions have expired like a milk carton, making them irrelevant for modern practice. And that language systematically ignores the historical record that shows these instructions were canceled by a Roman emperor and his councils via legal decree, not by a new covenant revelation.
The term Old Covenant is used today to justify the Constantinian Detour.
That's right.
Ultimately, the source materials stress that when we're examining this history, we have to remember we are dealing entirely with the winner's narrative.
Rome won the political war in the 4th century. They had the power of the state, which allowed them not only to enforce their decrees, but also to systematically destroy the writings of the Nazarenes and the original followers of the way.
History is written by the victors.
And we are primarily left with the authorized versions of history written by the people who initiated and enforced the canceling, the story of the emperor and the institutional winners, not the story of the victims who faced anathema or the pork loyalty test.
This is why the legal decrees, the canons and edicts, are the historical smoking guns.
Yes, they prove without any theological bias the forceful, non-organic nature of the detour.
So this deep dive has concluded its mission, tracing the 1,700-year detour from the one new man unity and the circumcision of the heart, the Nazarene Blueprint, to a state-merged institution built on political stability, enforced separation, and the systemic criminalization of the Father's law.
And the sources highlight that the legal tools that were used, the weaponization of labels, the forced assimilation rituals like the pork test, the decrees of anathema, this is not just ancient history. The structural blueprint of that Roman strategy designed to divide and conquer the unified apostolic way by making obedience toxic is a recurring model for institutional division and conformity.
It provides profound clarity on why the historical record is so messy, reminding us that we often only have the victor's narrative. To reconstruct the path that was canceled, we have to use the legal documents, the actual canons and edicts, as objective, non-theological proof of force.
Ultimately, the legal foundation of the modern institutional church rests on political and legal decrees issued by Roman emperors and councils who were seeking stability, not on a new spiritual revelation of freedom from the law. We are, in a very real sense, following a time clock that was set in 325 AD.
So what does this all mean for you, the learner, today? What is the final provocative thought that builds on this historical legal inquiry?
Well, the source material shows that the detour was fundamentally achieved by making the Father's law debatable rather than absolute, and then using institutional structure, the payroll, accreditation, the pulpit, to enforce the winner's side of that debate.
The penalty of anathema for Judaizing in the 4th century mirrors the modern institutional penalty of being canceled or losing your credentials for being legalistic.
So the final question is this. If this historical detour was maintained by professional penalties used to bypass the necessity of obedience, how often do modern traditions still rely on that original 4th century debate, the one established by the emperor, to bypass the absolute necessity of the circumcision of the heart? Think about the high cost of truth and what foundation you are standing on when you are told the law is canceled.